to you by the Governor's Council on Climate Change. On April 22nd, 2015, Governor Malloy issued an executive order creating the Governor's Council on Climate Change, also known as the GC3. The Council is charged with examining the efficacy of existing policies and regulations designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and identify new strategies to meet the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. The Council is composed of 15 members from state agencies, quasi-state agencies, businesses, and nonprofits. To learn more about the GC3, please go to www.ct.gov/DEEP/GC3. The webinar series explores innovative and successful climate change solutions in Connecticut and the nation. The series provides first-hand accounts of high-profile municipal climate programs, climate initiatives in the corporate world, new greenhouse gas reporting frameworks, statewide sustainability programs, low-carbon fuel initiatives, and other programs and projects to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve climate resilience. Today, we're excited to have Ross Spiegel, Architect and Specifications Coordinator at the SLAM Collaborative. Ross will provide an overview of green building rating systems and their impact on sustainability, energy efficiency, and resiliency. We will hear how these programs have been used in Connecticut and how they address climate change. He will also provide information on how the Connecticut Green Building Council supports these programs and works to advance green building in the state. The presentation will be about 40 minutes long, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. If you have a question, please submit your question in the question or the dialog box, and we'll read it aloud for Ross to respond to. But before we get started, for those of you listening via your computer speakers, and if you're experiencing poor sound quality, I do encourage you to call in using your telephone. So with that, Ross, thank you so much for your willingness to present today.
Thank you, Terry.
And I will turn it over to you to start.
Very good. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for attending, giving up your lunch hour to listen to me and learn a little bit about green building rating systems and how they have worked in the state of Connecticut. A little bit about me before we get started with the content exactly. I've been involved with the U.S. Green Building Council since 1994. I was appointed as liaison to them by one of my professional associations that I belong to, and I've continued in that role through today. As some of you may know, USGBC started with a staff of 3 and perhaps 200 members back in those early 90s, and has grown to the point where, you know, it's a multi-million-dollar organization with green building rating systems, not only here in the U.S., but also Canada and other countries around the world. They've also expanded into other rating systems that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So I've served on the board of directors for USGBC. I've been on the lead steering committee. I've chaired a multitude of different committees for USGBC, and then migrated to the Green Building Certification Institute, where I chaired the Accreditation Credentialing Committee for 4.5 years. That's the folks that put together the testing and requirements for the LEED AP exams that are currently being used. And then about 6 years ago, I was elected to the board of directors of the Connecticut Green Building Council, and I've served as chair of the advocacy committee there for the last 4 years. This year I was elected secretary of the board for a 2-year term. So I've continued my enthusiasm and participation in green buildings here on the local level, and I'm pleased to be able to share with you some of what I've learned over that history of my involvement with both USGBC and CTGBC. So let's get started with today's webinar. First, I will talk about an overview of the green building rating systems that are out there, a little bit about the history of the rating systems, and then focus in on the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, or LEED, green building rating system, primarily because it has the most impact, the most number of buildings registered and certified of all of the rating systems currently in use here in the U.S. We'll talk about the impact that the green building rating systems and LEED specifically has on sustainability, energy efficiency, and resiliency. Next, going on to focus more on the impact it's had in the state of Connecticut, both as a rating system and as spurring the state's guidelines for green buildings as well. Talk about then how this impacts or addresses climate change, and then we'll wrap up with time for your questions. I'll ask you to bear with me. I've been fighting a cold during the week, and talking tends to dry me out and causes me to cough, but I've got a bottle of water and I've got throat lozenges, so I hope to avoid coughing into the speaker, so that's all you hear instead of my speaking. All right, let's kick off with a history of rating systems. Sustainable design, as we know it today, began to form in the early 90s in the UK, believe it or not, with the first rating system, BREEAM, which is still in existence today, and including the US, is actually has the largest number of buildings and the largest square footage of certified buildings in the world. Something that they're happy to tell you if you visit their website. But if some of you, if you've been around long enough, will remember back in the 70s when solar power became a big issue and people were very enthused about it. But unfortunately, it was a little bit premature and it faded away. And you didn't really hear much about it until the 90s, after we had experienced fuel shortages and were becoming more and more concerned about how we were going to power our buildings in the future, as well as the impacts that the amount of construction we were doing, as well as transportation, was causing on the environment. So early in, or not early, but mid-1990s, the U.S. Green Building Council had a proposal made to it by one of its board members to create a green building rating system. It wasn't called LEED at the time, but the proposal was to work on the establishment of a rating system to quantify how well buildings were doing based upon using certain measures that would be recommended by the system as compared to a traditional or conventional building. That motion was passed and the board adopted that policy or that recommendation, and gradually a LEED steering committee was put together. There was a name given to the rating system, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. Late 90s, they finally produced the first draft of the LEED rating system called version 1.0. It was a pilot version. There were 10 projects that volunteered to use the draft of the rating system to see how well they scored and also how well the rating system worked. So part of the process that USGBC has used, not only from the beginning but all throughout the history of LEED, is one of consensus-based approval. So the draft of the rating system was prepared by the steering committee and the subcommittees working under it. It was submitted to the membership for comment, feedback, and input, and I can tell you we got a lot. There was quite a bit from the state of California who thought that LEED wasn't going far enough, and I think what I found most amusing at the time was the levels of achievement were called bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. Today, we don't have bronze. Instead, that was changed to certified before the rating system was officially kicked off. The state of Connecticut commented on the award level designations and wanted to know why the LEED steering committee had decided to use metals, heavy metals, to designate different achievement levels. And the truth is that those levels were picked and the designations were picked to reflect the awards that were given out, at least some of them, at the Olympics. So that was the rationale. But they did change, as I said, the bronze, which was the first level, to certified, and that designation system remains in effect today. So after the pilot projects went through the effort of being certified, in March of 2000, at a public meeting held in Washington, D.C., the council announced the first 10 LEED certified projects, which were drawn from around the country. And so that was the official launch of the first official version of LEED, version 2.0 in 2000. At the same time, BREEAM had been investigated and considered for use outside of the UK. And the first place that it showed up was in Canada, where it became a different titled rating system called Green Globes. And eventually in 2004, it was launched here in the US. And I remember that because I attended the kickoff day-long seminar that introduced Green Globes to the state of Connecticut back then. And that system also remains active and viable today. It is a different type of rating system than the USGBC in terms of how the scoring is done, how the evaluation is done. We could do a more than an hour seminar just talking about that comparison between the two. One of the features of the LEED Green Building Rating System has been continuous improvement. They are constantly tweaking, revising, questioning what the rating system includes and how it impacts the environment and building construction as well. In 2009 was the first time that by then the third edition of LEED, where they really threw everything up in the air and reconsidered what they were measuring in the LEED rating system. And so the 2009 or version 3 of the LEED rating system had many, many changes beyond what was originally envisioned in the rating systems. At the same time that this was happening, the number of rating systems that were available within LEED, or the type of building types, expanded. It was originally designed to consider rating just new construction and major renovation for office buildings. It was not intended to be used for other types of projects. But as the rating system evolved, it was expanded to be applied to schools, to healthcare, to warehouses, and other building types that were not originally considered in the LEED rating system. From that, the next big jump was to develop a LEED for existing buildings rating system, which is very different than the LEED for new construction rating systems, because the LEED for existing buildings rating system measured building performance, maintenance, and operation, and did not consider construction because the building was existing. And that rating system also continues today. The next rating system that was introduced that was a major difference was LEED ND, or LEED for neighborhood development, which for the first time looked at rating a development or a construction based upon the overall development that the project was located in. All of the other rating systems considered a building only, did not really look at multiple buildings, did not look at the impact beyond the building and its immediate surrounds. And LEED ND expanded that to a much wider range. So at the same time that this was happening, the state of Connecticut was considering making LEED a mandatory requirement for projects that were funded by the state or supported by the state through one of their agencies. But ultimately, after going back and forth over the course of a couple of years of different legislation, it was decided to incorporate the state's requirements for green buildings into what became known as the Connecticut Building Standard Guidelines for High Performance Buildings. and that was released in 2009, the first edition of that. If you look at those guidelines, you will see that many of these, they don't call them credits, they call them strategies, mirror what was in LEED version 2.0 at the time. And they included both optional strategies and mandatory strategies that had to be achieved. In 2011, September of that year, the state issued an updated set of standard guidelines to build on what they had established in 2009. In the meantime, once again, the U.S. Green Building Council, through the LEED Steering Committee and the various subcommittees, was working on the next iteration of LEED, which originally was going to be known as LEED 2012, but they abandoned the year and instead adopted LEED version 4 because of the amount of feedback that they were getting and public comment they were getting to the revisions to the LEED version 3 that had been released in 2009. So eventually, LEED version 4 was officially launched in 2014, but they simultaneously allowed projects to still register under the previous system up until a point in 2015 or 2016 when they closed down registration for LEED 2009, and then from then on, only LEED version 4 projects could be registered. So, although we've talked a lot about LEED and a little bit about Green Globes and a little bit about BREEAM, there are several other rating systems which are out there today. Some of them take a different tack to what the LEED rating system attempts to achieve. Some of them go beyond the LEED rating system. So to reiterate, we had leadership in energy and environmental design with all the various building types that are now covered under different rating systems within that system. We have the Green Globes rating system, which also has, for new construction, for existing construction and interiors, similar to what USGBC LEED has. And in many cases, both organizations have compared their rating systems to each other to highlight the differences between them. BREEAM, which, as I mentioned, is a UK-based rating system, actually felt that there was an open market for them to launch a rating system here in the U.S., and they did that earlier this year by launching BREEAM for existing buildings in the U.S. So that currently is the only rating system that you can use here in the States for certifying buildings under their system. It is, once again, different than LEED. It is somewhat similar to Green Globes, but it has a wide acceptance around the world, so it's something to look into as well. The Connecticut Building Standard Guidelines for High-Performance Buildings pretty much has stayed the same from the issuance in September 2011 of the update, although they have recently updated one component of it, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Several years ago, the Cascadia chapter of the U.S. Green Building Council launched the Living Building Challenge as a standalone organization and developed a rating system using what they call petals to certify buildings, and they do go one step beyond LEED. It is a much more difficult rating system to achieve a certification under, but it certainly looks at a wider range of considerations beyond just building construction in its arsenal of credits and strategies. There is also Energy Star, which is an EPA DOE program that's been around for quite some time, which is a single attribute program as opposed to the others, which are multi-attribute. The Energy Star program is very focused on energy consumption. It's freely available. There's no registration fee. There's no charge for getting your project certified, but it is something that you will have to annually get recertified in. And EPA makes a big deal out of projects that achieve that. Recently, they also launched another program called WaterSense, whose purpose is to address the use of water in buildings, and that's now available through EPA as well. Another rating system is a passive house, which is really devoted to residential construction and seeks to do a low or no energy housing development for projects, so that it really does mean passive house, where you're not using energy from the grid to run your house on a daily basis. As I mentioned earlier, USGBC has expanded beyond its original LEED certification program. They now manage a program called SITES, which deals with the external development of property. This program was developed by the American Society for Landscape Architects, and ultimately GBCI, which is the certification institute arm of USGBC that runs their certification programs, signed an agreement to manage that program as well. There is also a green parking garage certification program that they manage, which was also developed outside of USGBC by the parking garage industry. And most recently, they have issued or released a well building standard, which really deals more with building occupancy and the people that are in the buildings than it does with building construction. All of those are viewable on the usgbc.org website, so you can learn more in either of those places. There is now one more program similar to WELL, which is called FitWell, which is also introduced recently, which you can check out. It's I don't know enough about it to go into it in depth, but I can tell you that it's similar to the well building program. And you should take a look at that if you're interested in WELL to do a point of comparison. So let's talk a little bit now about how green building rating systems fit in. Green building rating systems are really geared toward improving water usage, energy efficiency, the indoor environmental quality, which is both air quality and audio quality of the environment inside the building, the materials that are used in the construction, and finally the impact that the building has on the site. Right now, LEED is being used throughout North America, both here and in Canada. Canada has its own version of LEED that was, it's a takeoff on LEED from the US, and also in 30 countries around the globe. What you'll find is that USGBC was responsible for the development and creation of a World Building Council, which includes USGBC, but also includes green building councils elsewhere around the globe. And they all have adopted in one shape or form the LEED Green Building Rating System. Right now, there are over 21,000 projects that are registered under the LEED, one of the LEED rating systems. There are also 6,300 projects which have been certified under the LEED program, also around the globe. Recently, it's interesting if you look at the statistics for where projects are being registered and certified, you will see a very large upswing in China and India, more so than here in the US and elsewhere around the world. And they have been pushing the envelope in size, in terms of size of projects that they've been certifying, and the level of achievement that they have been reaching. The highest level of LEED certification is platinum, and a slide that I'll show you here shortly will show you, at least for the state of Connecticut, the number of projects that have achieved LEED certification in each of the different levels. you'll find that platinum is very small, not only here but elsewhere, but a lot of the projects that have been certified at platinum level are outside of the U.S. as well. If you look at the LEED rating system, there are credits that are divided up into 7 different categories. And some of them have come from some of the other rating systems as well. And the purpose of LEED, what LEED hopes to achieve, is to promote a transformation of the construction industry through the strategies that are designed to achieve certain specific goals. And we'll talk about that a little bit more depth here shortly. It also means to address environmental challenges while at the same time responding to the needs of a competitive marketplace. USGBC is very much aware of the forces out there that are seeking to achieve a sustainable building, a green building, that does not impact their budget for that. And that's always been a challenge for green building construction, is how do I design and build a building without skyrocketing the cost of not only constructing, but owning and operating a green building. So if we look at the goals that the LEED rating system has established, and I have to go back to what I said earlier, these goals actually came out in the 2009 version of the LEED Green Building Rating System, because they really, at that point, they did a very big shift in the way they were constructing the credits and prerequisites. And I should mention that there are prerequisites within the Green Building Rating System, which are requirements that you must meet to even be able to achieve points to get certified. And then there are optional credits throughout the rating system, which now total 110 credits. But the different levels of credits are determined, or excuse me, of achievement are determined by how many credits you get on the scale that's established by USGBC. So their goals that they had in the 2009 and now version 4 were to reverse the contribution to global climate change through the construction of buildings, also to enhance the individual human health and well-being. They also wanted to protect and restore water resources, to promote, enhance, and restore biodiversity and ecosystem services, to promote sustainable and regenerative material resources cycles, to build a greener economy, and to enhance social equity, environmental justice, community health, and the quality of life. And they've done this through the credit categories that they have today within LEED version 4. The one part of LEED that came out in the LEED for Healthcare rating system when it was first issued, and it came out between LEED 2009 and LEED version 4, was it added credits for the integrative process, with the belief that integrating the entire design and construction team from the day that the project started really was a strong driver to making sure that the project was designed with sustainable goals in mind, and that it was built that way and then owned and operated when it was done. They also then had a category called location and transportation. This actually came in from the LEED for Neighborhood Development rating system, many of the components, but also some of them were moved over from the sustainable sites category. Then there are sustainable sites, which had been in existence before, but now it's somewhat smaller. Water efficiency, which has changed over the years from having no prerequisite. You actually got credits for reducing water usage to having a prerequisite for reducing water usage, and then you get a credit for higher water reduction. Excuse me. There is also a credits for energy and atmosphere. That's the next category, which rewards projects for how much they reduce energy usage in the building that's designed. Next category was material and resources, which looked at originally single attribute qualities such as recycled content, excuse me, I muted myself so I could cough. Regional materials, certified wood, and other attributes that were taken alone. In the LEED version 4, all of these were now combined, and you had to now get products that met more than one attribute in order to get credits within the rating system. Excuse me. The indoor environmental quality category includes both the use of methods to avoid contaminating the indoor environment so that people aren't affected. Sorry, I didn't want to cough in everyone's ear again. The indoor environmental quality also deals with the environment from a sound standpoint, how people are able to work in an indoor environment without being disturbed by audio from elsewhere within the building. And so this category has expanded. Originally, some of the components that are in version 4 were only appearing in LEED for Schools in the 2009 edition. They have a category for innovation, which allows you to get credits for trying things that are not in the rating system. And finally, not a category, but you get extra credit for addressing regional priority credits. And the way this works is USGBC determines on a zip code basis certain credits that are more difficult to achieve in that particular zip code or that area location. So if you attempt these identified credits, and usually there are 6 that you can attempt, that you can choose from, excuse me, but only 4 that you're allowed to attempt. In addition to the credits you would get for achieving that particular item, you'd also get an additional credit. So that's a broad overview of what's in the LEED version 4 rating system. And all of this was meant to, among other things, reverse the contribution to global climate change from buildings. And they did this in the rating system by targeting building operations, specifically energy use, by reducing that energy use, which would affect greenhouse gas emissions. They also attempted to target energy use reduction that's associated with transportation for building occupants, employees, customers, visitors, and others by encouraging the location of projects in areas where public transportation was available or where people could commute to work or to the building without using an individual driven car, which also by being able to reduce that, reduces the impact on greenhouse gas emissions as well. Third was to target greenhouse gas emission reduction from the embodied energy necessary to create building materials and also through water use. Next was they targeted the greenhouse gas emissions to reduce them by using a cleaner energy supply. So credits are awarded for using either site-based alternative energy sources or by contracting off-site to offset energy use through alternative energy sources such as wind and solar. And finally, they wanted to address the non-energy related climate change drivers, albedo, carbon sinks, etc., through the green building rating system. So here's how green building rating systems can help. LEED certified buildings are designed to deliver these benefits to the occupants, the owners, and visitors to lower the operating costs and increase the value of the asset, which is the building. There have been studies that have been done elsewhere around the country showing that constructing a green building has increased the value of the building when it goes for resale if it's a privately owned building. It has definitely impacted the cost of operating the buildings through the strategies of reduced energy consumption, through a healthier indoor building, and also through the reduction in the use of water. What's interesting was there's another study was done, I believe in California, which tried to evaluate the impact on the building operation and maintenance costs when the building had a healthier indoor environment. They found that there was a reduction in the number of days that people took off for sick leave or because they weren't feeling well. Also that their work efforts improved when the air that they breathed in the building was healthier for them, and also when there was less sound trespass in their workspace. They also looked to reduce the amount of waste that was sent to landfills, and that is, I think, in my mind, of the 20 or so projects that I've worked on for LEED certification, we have easily been able to achieve a 95% diversion rate from the landfill of construction and demolition debris. In many cases, we were able to achieve 99%. It just required a lot of planning up front to make sure that happened. And as I mentioned before, also to reduce the amount of energy and water usage within the building. One of the other features of LEED that was instituted back in 2009 was a requirement that when you registered a building for LEED certification and the building was certified, you had to agree to provide annual reports on energy and water usage for the building for 5 years after the certification was awarded. Excuse me. So they found that the energy usage pretty much tracked what the projection was, where the fall-off was in the comparison of water usage to what was projected. So they're working on tightening that up so that they can really affect water usage much more strongly. They also wanted to have healthy and productive environments for occupants. They looked to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the construction and operation of the building, and also wanted to have buildings that would qualify for tax rebates, zoning allowances, and other incentives, which has been adopted in many cities throughout the country. In some cities, there's actually, they instituted an accelerated building permit process if your building was seeking LEED certification. So I think, you know, this is a great reaction to a voluntary program by some government agencies. So now let's look at the LEED and Connecticut Green Building Standard guidelines and how those two work together. So the high performance guidelines apply solely to state-funded buildings, both government buildings and schools, whether they are constructed by the state or funded by the state. And you can use, in the guidelines, it allows you to use a LEED Silver certification or a Green Globes 2 Globe certification as an option to demonstrate compliance with the optional strategies. What's interesting is if you look at the guidelines, and this is a September 2011 version, the guidelines do contain some requirements that are not included in LEED or Green Globes. They've gone beyond that in some cases. As I mentioned earlier, the guidelines contain both mandatory and optional requirements. You must comply with the mandatory requirements. Excuse me, there is a rating sheet or a checklist that you follow when you're doing a checklist project, excuse me, a guidelines project, and you get to add up points. You have to have a minimum number of points of optional strategies. in order to be approved. So although there is not a registration fee and you're not submitting a wealth of documentation as you do with LEED or Green Globes, you do still have to be able to demonstrate how the project has achieved the goals that you set for it at the beginning. And finally, the energy performance guidelines that are in the high performance building guidelines were just updated to reflect the adoption of the 2016 Connecticut Building Code and the 2012 International Energy Efficiency Code, which has heightened requirements for reduction in energy usage. So one of the things that USGBC does is they make available the state market brief, one for each state. They update it regularly. And as you can see on your screen, it gives some interesting information. It shows you how the registrations and how the certifications have changed over time. And you can see this is specifically for the state of Connecticut. You can see which LEED rating systems were used, which level of achievement in LEED they have attained. And you can see that gold certified buildings just break above silver in this instance. And as I mentioned earlier, you can see there are only 14 platinum certified buildings. What's interesting is that if you look at the space type, the most certifications are in office and office mixed use, retail, and education. And I think that's where the push has been. And if you look at the owner sector, you can see that corporate and investor sector is where they've had the most certified buildings in Connecticut. And I think that the private industry has recognized the value of green certification from this. So let's take a look here before we wrap of how the green building rating systems help fight climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Because buildings affect the climate, 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. Building green reduces the impact of buildings on contributions to the climate change. But it also builds resilience into homes and communities. They're only now beginning to, in greater depth, address resiliency as a feature of green buildings, and that will continue to evolve as they learn more about methods that can be used to support that. In addition, the green building rating systems generates less greenhouse gases. The green building covers planning, design, construction operations, and end-of-life renewal or recycling. It also reduces landfill waste and encourages and enables alternative transportation use. I will tell you here in my office in Glastonbury that many people use a bike to get to work, and obviously not in the wintertime so much, but now when the weather is nice, we have a host of people who don't drive their cars to work and instead bicycle in the morning and bicycle home in the evening. Another feature of green buildings is that they generate less greenhouse gases. There was a study done in 2014 by the University of California, Berkeley, which found that LEED buildings contributed 50% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than a conventionally constructed building due to water consumption, a 48% reduction due to solid waste, and 5% reduction due to transportation. And then lastly, green buildings reduce the carbon footprint beyond what energy efficiency alone does by providing inhabitant feedback and showcasing the building's environmental performance, which in turn drives further reductions. So with that, we have about 15 or so minutes left, and then I'll stop talking and ask Carrie if we have any questions.
Great, thank you so much. That was really informative and a lot of great detail. on the various grading programs. So I do have some questions to start with, and folks, if you have questions on the line, go ahead and submit them via the question and answer dialog box, and I'll read them aloud. So the first question, which states are leading when it comes to deploying LEED buildings?
That's a good question. And as you might suspect, California, which has always been a leader in green building certification, and because of the impact they have on the environment with the number of cars that are joined, and just overall they've been much more sensitive to this. They were doing things before the LEED Green Building Rating System was out there. But more recently, you're starting to see places like Illinois, with Chicago leading the way, Washington, D.C., increasing the number of green buildings. Every year, USGBC does a survey and issues a press release indicating which states and cities are the leaders for that year in the number of green buildings that have been certified in their area. And I think you'll find Boston and New York on that list as well, being big cities.
Great, thanks. And Connecticut has an old building stock. Can we, and if so, how can we retrofit to meet these type of aggressive standards?
That's a good question, and I know that I have worked on several projects which have been existing buildings. And I'll talk about one that I worked on, which was actually became the headquarters building for the firm that I worked with before coming to SLAM. It was a bank building which had been vacant for 27 years. It was built, the last iteration of the building was done in 1930, although the building, parts of the building dated back to the late 1800s, but the main part of it was done from 1910 to 1920. So we had a well-preserved existing building, which, aside from being outdated and abandoned, had great systems that, it was a great shell of a building that could be retained. And it was within a historic district, so we weren't allowed to make any changes that the State Historic Preservation Office would not approve, which meant that the building envelope had to remain the same. We couldn't change the external appearance, and also there were parts in the existing building interiors that had to remain. So the areas that we had to focus on were the interiors, the energy use, water use, and the materials that we brought in to retrofit the interior of the building. And we did that, and when I left that firm, the building had not yet achieved certification, but we were well on our way to applying for a gold level certification. So it is possible to do that, but it really requires a lot of upfront work with the owner of the building, with the engineering team and the architectural team, and if you're fortunate enough to have a contractor on board early enough, all working together to look at the different options that are available for mechanical systems, for electrical systems, lighting. We tended to use all LED lighting throughout that building to reduce the watts per square foot way below what is normal, without reducing the visual clarity that people had to work at their desks. So it is possible. The only consideration you would strongly have to look at is what is the cost of doing these things against the cost of the building renovations themselves.
So that's actually a follow-up question. Are these types of buildings more expensive to build and or operate?
Not necessarily, because if you take into consideration if they just tore down that building, if they're able to, and start and build over, you would have the cost of demolition, which would not be included if you were working off of a clean site with nothing constructed on it previously. You then have the cost of site development plus the cost of construction. So it's always, I think, better not only for the environment but also for the use of energy and water and construction materials itself to use an existing building if they're available and if they're recoverable. There are so many examples here in Connecticut, and they're continuing to be developed as we speak. There are others that are under development right now, which seek to use long vacant buildings, reuse long vacant buildings for new purposes. Usually vacant factories, et cetera, turned into housing, new office buildings, et cetera. And I don't think the people who are doing these, who are private developers, would attempt this if it was a more expensive equation than, you know, starting fresh. I think that was the question. Carrie.
And is some of so sorry, let me frame, this is my question actually. You can build a building to the standards of a LEED threshold, you know, the different levels, the bronze, the silver, et cetera, and not certify it, correct?
Yes. We've also seen, go ahead, I'm sorry.
And is there, at this point in time, is there a mainstreaming of a certain amount of the requirements for one of the levels that pretty much everyone does?
Yeah, I think, you know, that entry level, which is certified, is, of course, the easiest to achieve. But what I'm seeing is when anybody attempts LEED certification, they always want to achieve silver because it's become really the de facto level. And you're seeing more and more projects now trying to achieve gold certification. But to the first part of your question, I think that what you're seeing is in a lot of projects where the owner determines that really doesn't need to get certified, doesn't need a plaque on the wall, doesn't really feel that going through the process is worth it, we'll ask the designers to incorporate many of the touchstones that are in one of the rating systems into the building. So as an example, we usually incorporate recycled content, low VOC, healthy materials into our building design, irregardless of whether the project is seeking certification or not. These materials have become so commonplace nowadays that there really is a very minimal upcharge for using those type of materials. So I think, you know, you're going to see more and more projects that, excuse me, do the right thing without attempting certification. In my mind, doing anything is better than doing nothing.
Great, thanks. What is the impact of the manufacturing and disposal of alternative energy resources, such as solar panels and wind turbines, versus the benefit they provide?
That's a good question.
It's a large question.
Yeah, it is, and it's, I'm not sure that I can answer all of it. I think what you've seen over the last couple of years, excuse me, as solar panels have taken off, if you will, and the cost of manufacturing them has continually dropped, and now we're at a point where providing power through solar panels is equal to, or perhaps now even less than traditionally produced power. Windmills are coming up close behind. Not here in the U.S. as much, but elsewhere, although you are starting to see it more and more. For those of you in the southern end of the state, if you're driving on 95 headed to New Haven, if you look off on the right-hand side as you get towards, before you cross over the Quinnipiac Bridge, you'll see a one windmill that's standing there, one turbine that I understand is a demonstration project. But really, Connecticut doesn't have a great environment throughout the state for wind farms, but there are areas that work. So I think you do have to take into consideration, and I don't know that many people have. I have not seen any studies myself of that showing, you know, what's the impact of the process of making, transporting, and installing solar panels or wind turbines versus the benefit that they provide. I think that will only come clearer when the cost of all of this energy reduces to the point where people are saying, yeah, well, let's see what the other end of the equation is. That's the best answer I can give on that question right at the moment.
The only thing I'd add to that is there have been studies on life cycle analysis of looking at the manufacturing of solar panels and wind turbines and the transportation that it takes to get it to the site. So there's a lot of variables, obviously, that go into doing those types of analyses, but the majority of them do find them to be less energy intensive to create the product than what it puts out. So I guess I would reference the person to take a look at life cycle analysis of different manufacturing products.
Good. Thanks for that, Carrie. Go ahead.
A couple other questions. If folks have any dying questions before we wrap it up, I have two more here.
Yeah, there was one. Let me add one thing there. One of the things that changed in the LEED rating system, which I applaud, is one of the complaints that I heard all the time with LEED version 2009, especially about materials, was that there was no calculation, no impact considered when you were looking at building materials to how you get them to the site. And I had conversations with Connecticut-based manufacturers who would say, how can I compete against a national manufacturer? My product is equal to theirs. The only difference is they're transporting their product from Texas, California, or elsewhere. There's nothing making their product negative in the rating system for the transportation. And USGBC heard that comment a lot. So when they did LEED version 4 and they wrapped all of the material credits, instead of being single attribute, into multi-attribute, through the environmental product declarations and health product declarations, those documents that I just mentioned now include the impact of the energy needed to produce and manufacture products, to get the raw materials, and also to transport them from the place of manufacture to another location. So I think that's a good change that has happened due to the rating system, and hopefully that'll continue to evolve as time goes on. Now, your last two questions that you have.
Great. So they're kind of related. So a good example of LEED buildings in Connecticut, and are there any living building challenge buildings in Connecticut?
There are good examples of LEED certified buildings in Connecticut. I would have to get that list together and share that. I don't, off the top of my head, have that. What I found was very interesting when I looked at that list some time ago was that Kohl's department stores are generally certified for LEED, and I think it was Stop and Shop supermarkets also have made that a feature of that. I know that CVS Pharmacy in West Haven, that they had a platinum certified store there, but that's just in those areas. I'd have to look to see on the other projects. I know I did a couple of projects at Norwalk Community College, which were gold certified, and also there's multiple projects at the Yukon Health Center, which have achieved certification as well. But beyond that, I'd have to really get a list together if people would like that.
The only campus I'd add to that is Yale's campus has quite a few LEED buildings and a private building.
You're absolutely correct. Thank you.
And are there any living building challenges buildings in Connecticut?
There are some, and I'm not as familiar with those. One of my fellow board members on the Connecticut Green Building Council there is a Connecticut group for that, and you'll find their page on Facebook. They are closely aligned with the Connecticut Green Building Council. That is something, once again, that I'd have to do a little bit of looking into to give you the names of those projects. There aren't as many Living Building Challenge certified projects anywhere because it's still a relatively new and a relatively difficult certification to achieve.
Great. So that's all the questions I have, and it's 1 o'clock. So thank you again so much for your time and the wonderful presentation. We will post a PDF of it as well as a recording on our website. likely after the holiday. So do encourage others who weren't able to attend to go ahead and view it at another time. And I hope everyone has a great holiday next week. And we will be announcing our next webinar, which will likely be in August. We'll skip the month of July since folks are on vacation, and put out the announcement later in July for an August webinar. So thanks again. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you. You too, Carrie. Bye.
Bye.